Ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll get started. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko, and I have the very good fortune of directing our environmental change and security program. And on behalf of my colleagues Blair Rubel and Lauren Herzer in Comparative Urban Studies, and really on behalf of our president and director Jane Harmon, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this discussion that features five of our colleagues and guests who've come in for what has been a very rich, almost 3 days worth of discussions on a wide range of issues looking at disasters, both natural and human caused, and the way that we respond to them with a real great diversity of experience made possible through what has been a very exciting collaboration with the Fetzer Institute. And Megan Scribner is here as well from Fetzer. This is the third year of collaboration, third workshop year, third opportunity to bring together really a world-class diverse group of experts from practitioner to scholarly world and kind of everything in between. And as you'll see that reflected in the backgrounds and the experiences of people on this panel, but I can't say, I've been here at the center 13 years, and I can't say there have been any set of meetings that have had a more diverse and impressive group of people than this Fetzer Institute. And believe you me, we've had a lot of meetings, or at least I've had a lot of meetings. So it's saying something. It really is just a tremendously impressive group of people. We've entitled today's session, Responding to Disasters, Myths, Mistakes, and Recovery. And we will hear from kind of very different takes on that, different political levels, different types of disasters, tackling different myths and mistakes, and offering some paths forward, put forward modestly, but learned in the field in so many ways, the field being defined in so many ways. So it's really our pleasure here at the Wilson Center to, again, be collaborating with Fetzer and to hear from such interesting people on topics that are literally life and death in so many instances and really matter, as well as being stimulating and important analytical and research topics are really also frontline issues. So I will be very quick in introducing our distinguished guests, in part because you were able to pick up their bio information along with the participants list. I think we will just go in alphabetical order as I introduce them, and then we can adopt that strategy for having them speak to you. Paul Bourne, down on the far end, is he co-founded and directs Tamarack, an institute for community engagement, and really focusing on alleviating poverty in local communities. Paul is based in Canada and has been a recidivist, shall we say, in the Fetzer discussions, and has really been a very valuable voice of continuity through these. And so, to Paul, it's wonderful to have you kick us off. Skip Burkle is going to speak next. Skip is, we're pleased to say, affiliated with the center as a senior scholar. He's also senior fellow and scientist at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and at the Harvard School of Public Health, as well as affiliated with Johns Hopkins and a number of places. Australia, he's got some terrific affiliations where I think he's picking up different pieces from different ones and bringing it all together. Skip will share his insights from a long and distinguished practitioner career, often first one in for the U.S. government and others in post-conflict and post-disaster situations, in primary focus on public health. And so Skip has been somebody that we at the Wilson Center have learned an awful lot from and have collaborated with a great deal, and it's wonderful to have him back at the center. Leonard Doyle is a journalist. I promised diversity of backgrounds and experiences. He's now working out of Haiti, but he's working for the International Organization of Migration. And so it's been very interesting here about these kind of almost dual roles within himself of journalist and working with an international organization. Lots on communication, from giving voice to these people in a post-disaster situation. And so we're looking very much forward to Leonard's remarks. Arif Hasan is an architect and a planner, somebody who has really been a leading light in innovation in a broad set of challenges in addressing, well, in his native Pakistan, but really developing models that have gone far beyond that. We so the Orangi Pilot Project in terms of urban sanitation is one that he's best known for, but in a long list of books and publications and consultations has made a real difference in bringing very practical skills, but a broad and inclusive and holistic perspective to meeting the needs of those in these disaster situations. And then last but certainly not least, Eliane Ubalijoro is the founder and executive director of CLEAR, which is the Center for Leadership Excellence in Applied Research, International Development, Inc. Eliane is again, like our guests, a diversity of experiences that she's bringing together to find ways to practically help people in a range of different settings, often in sub-Saharan Africa, most directly through roles such as being a member of the Presidential Advisory Council for the Rwandan President Paul Kagame. But a mix of kind of poverty and environment and gender in ways that she is able to do that both in working in Canada and working in Rwanda and places kind of on both sides of the Atlantic, so to speak. And so we're wonderful to have Eliane join us as well. So I will be quiet and turn the floor over to Paul so that we can actually get to the substance of the discussion.
Do you want us to hear?
Either, whichever you prefer, up here or at the table.
What do you prefer? Probably over there, huh, for this row? Thanks, Jeff, and thanks to each of you for coming this afternoon. I think you were saying giving us each about 15 minutes? Is that what you were asking?
If we stick to it, then we should be fine.
Wonderful. It's been a wonderful 2 days, and to be part of such a distinguished group and such a diverse group from all over the world has been just tremendously stimulating for me and for all of us. We spoke at this gathering around the title, Retrieving the Wisdom of Those in Need, Community Engagement and Healing in Times of Disaster. I want to share with you 3 stories. Several years ago, as we were working in Northern Ireland, this was now at the height of the Troubles, we were bringing young people into Canada, about 200 a year, and we've been doing that for many years during the Troubles. And we would bring half IRA young people and half UFF, and particularly young people that were living on the border between Northern and Southern Ireland. This program was growing a lot, and our board was considering whether this might be the right thing for us to be doing. At one point, the President of Ireland was coming to visit our organization, and we needed to check both with the IRA and the UFF to see whether it might be okay for her to come and visit us. And we had learned this long ago, that in a sense they were the partners that we wished we didn't have, but we knew that we needed to work with them if this program was going to work. The IRA was fine. She had done something well for them, and the UFF had said no. So now we had to find this uncomfortable moment in which we would say to her, "You cannot come." And the board didn't like that, as you can see why. So the Irish government, feeling that we were sort of questioning our role, invited us to come for a tour. And this is now at the very height of the Troubles. We arrive, hadn't slept that night, flew overnight. First thing we do is our cab driver drives up to our hotel and says, "You're staying here, are you sure?" And we said, "Yeah, that's where they've got us." And he said, "Well, this was just bombed a month ago." And I said, "You can't see the wing, it's over there." I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I get up and they take us to the government offices that are hosting the tour. The building beside the government office had no windows in it, and the building that we were entering was a government building, not a lot different than this one. A steel door, no glass. Press a buzzer, 2 armed security guards come out and frisk you, and then allow you to go on to your meeting. The next morning, I wake up and I turn on the TV. I hadn't slept much, and saw that there had just been an assassination, and these were happening every fortnight. And when they mentioned where it was, I realized that that's where we were going, an assassination that was only 4 hours old. And we were now arriving in what was called the Gaza Strip, the Brookfield area of Northern Ireland. And as we entered into the Gaza Strip, on both sides of the road were walls that were 20 feet high. And they had built them because on one side of the road were Catholics and the other Protestants. And they used to get up on the roofs and shoot at each other. So they just built the walls high enough so that that couldn't happen. We enter into this community center, which was right in the middle of this neighborhood. And there were walls that were 15 feet high, barbed wire all around, and armed security guards that were letting us in. We come in, we go and see Father Miles Kavanagh, who had built this community center, had converted this flax building that was 5 stories high into a community center, into a community theater, into a community college, into an international trade center. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant place. He was quite busy, so he brought a community member along and sent us out for a walk. And as we were walking, we were just coming around a corner, and bang, I bumped into a soldier, a young British soldier with a loaded M16, coming around the corner, and they were doing political maneuver or exercise in a children's playground, and he happened to sort of stray off in our direction. We walked a little further, and we came to a mall. A mall, the first time that any retail area, any retail stores had been built in that area. And we had learned that the anchoring of that mall was a grocery store that had been secured because the IRA and the UFF had signed a 5-year labor agreement that if it was followed, they promised not to blow up the grocery store. You can tell we were sort of wondering if this place was safe, but yet we were with people that were positive, and as we headed back to meet with Father Miles Kavanagh, it was lunch now, and we're sitting around a table, not a lot smaller than the one that you're at today. And Father Miles Kavanagh is talking. And he's talking and talking, and it's very hard to get a word in edgewise. He knew that we were with government people that had a lot of money, who gave him a lot of money, and so he was selling the center. At one moment, I interrupted the father, and I said, "Father, this place is amazing." And I think the fact that he realized that I was going to compliment him just gave him a moment to take a breath and sit back to receive the compliment. And I said, "Father, this is just really amazing." I said, "When I think of the work that I do in my community, I could never imagine working under these conditions. And yet you have created here something that is short of a miracle. Nothing short of a miracle." And I said, "Father, how did you do it? How did you do this? How did you build this incredible center and bring all of these people together?" And then he said something that has been the product of now at least 2 of my books, and has been a product of many of the late night wonderings in my mind about how we might engage in these types of situations. He looked around to everyone at the table, and he said, "We listened, and we gained a corner on the obvious." We listened, and we gained a corner on the obvious. And I was so struck by that at that moment that, as you could see, it changed how I began to perceive all of the work. And I so wished that maybe I could work that way in my community, and that we might be able to work that way in the communities where there is so much strife. But the question is, how do we listen? The second story takes place here in the United States. And it is a place where I truly wish that they might have listened and gained a corner on the obvious. The story comes with a picture, and not thinking that we had PowerPoint, I'll show it to you on here. I don't know how many of you can see that. Can you see that at all? Anybody remember that picture? It was in the New York Times. And it happened shortly after Katrina. And it was taken to talk about these buses, nearly 2,000 of them. And as the waters were receding in New Orleans, you could see from a helicopter these 2,000 roofs of these buses just sitting there, idly, waiting for someone to use them. The New York Times goes on to tell this story. They waited, and they waited, and then they waited some more in the 90-degree heat. As many as 5,000 people huddled at a highway underpass on Interstate 10, waiting for buses that never arrived to take them away from the storm they could not escape. Babies cried, the sick huddled in the shade in wheelchairs or rested on cots. A few others, less patient, simply started walking west with nowhere to go, like a man pushing a bike in one hand and pulling a shopping cart in another. But most just waited with resignation, sad, angry, incredulous, scared, exhausted. People who seemed as discarded as the empty bottles of water and containers of food that littered the ground. New Orleans has always existed in a delicate balance between land and water, chaos and order, black and white, the very rich and the very poor. It has been the lacy ironwork of French Quarter balconies, the magical shops and galleries of Royal Street, and the cuisine not just at Galatier's or Mr. B's or Commander's Palace, but at humble po' boy joints and neighborhood restaurants in every part of town. But it has also been a place of crushing poverty, of dreary low-income housing and failing schools, where crime and violence have been an incessant shadow in daily life, as much a part of the local sensibility as the damp, smothering blanket of heat and humidity. This week, bit by bit, that delicate balance came completely undone. Water took over earth when levees broke, putting 80% of the city underwater. The mix of fatalism and bravado that allowed the city's biggest fear, a killer hurricane, to become the national drink of Bourbon Street, gave way to terror and despair and horrifying spasms of looting and violence. The city's evacuation plan worked except for thousands who were too poor or disabled to find their way out of the city before the storm. The radios and cell phones that officials and police officers used to communicate failed, erasing any remaining semblance of authority in a city beset by chaos and crime. And finally, a full federal response came only after the dialogue between local and federal officials devolved into shouting. It's estimated that those buses could have evacuated 20,000 people. Our team at the Tamarack Institute did a whole lot of research, including looking at their emergency preparedness plan. And we tried to evoke a conversation that was eventually picked up by the World Bank and published. We asked these questions. If people were engaged, had a role to play, knew what to do, were part of a team, would this have made a difference? Would those buses have been deployed to help people? Who owned the emergency preparedness plan? Whose job was it to see it implemented? What preparations were made? Were citizens engaged? What about the bus drivers? How prepared are we? What's my emergency preparedness plan? How much can government do alone? what do citizens do? Why do citizens become criminals? What role do factors like demographic makeup of the population, geographic layout play in emergency preparedness? Are some countries more effective than others at emergency preparedness? We ask these questions and more. A third story. In 1995, a Layar overflow destroyed the village of Talba, Philippines. In this event, the government communication system was disrupted and failed to give the proper warning to the residents. So they had set up a information system, and they had no thought that the lava might come down and destroy it. And it was a particularly bad explosion, and actually some of the rocks took it out. But it was a parallel warning system developed by the community people that warned them on time to vacate the area and avoid any loss of life. Resources of the community, like privately owned small boats, jeeps, and a truck, were used to move the village's population to safety. At the evacuation center, the Barangay Disaster Response Organization, which was the community organization, members augmented the national government's health personnel in the delivery of services to the survivors of Layar rampage. In the new area where the affected families of Talba were finally resettled, the barangay officials who joined them have been able to secure the needed services of water, electricity, and health assistance from the resettlement officials. The organized community were easily mobilized for action by the officials in support of requests made to the resettlement officials. The people's organization and the local authorities complemented each other in the acquisition of services, ensuring of the safety and welfare of the members of the community. 3 stories. 3 different lenses about what is available and what is possible in a community. Each one was able to discern how they might enter into this space. And essentially, the choice is made. Do we enter into that space through the lens that we bring what we bring, we do what we do it the way that we do it, and we do it very well? Or do we enter into that space asking the question that in this space of any type of disaster, of any type of conflict, what exists in this place is a wisdom. And if we enter into that space with a particular lens, a particular way that we might look, and a certain set of skills that can help that wisdom to arise, to become present, to show itself, and then use that wisdom to create the type of response that utilizes the assets and the skills and the knowledge that is present. Thank you very much.
Aloha. I'm from Hawaii, so I can say that and get away with it. Look, mine's going to take a totally different format. And really what I want you to all walk away from this just short discussion is to recognize how massively major crises and disasters have changed over the generations that we have lived in. And then catch up to date about what is no longer future crises, but is actually happening now and what you will be engaged in over the next couple of decades. But in my generation, we were first dealing primarily with conventional warfare, cross-border wars. Remember, that was the time when we had over 53 million refugees. We were all trained in the nuances of building refugee camps. The product out of that era were the sphere standards. How many of you even heard of the sphere standards? I'm sure. We thought that was great. It told us, how many pit latrines we were to build, and how close people could be, and if not, they would be more apt to get some infectious diseases. Everything was pretty much down there, and a lot of work went into it from the humanitarian organization. Plus, if you were going to make it as a professional, you knew the Geneva Conventions inside and out. I mean, there were a lot of really ground truth decisions that were made based on the Geneva Conventions. This era, slowly but surely, it happened so fast we didn't realize it. A lot of it had to do with the close of the Cold War, and a number of individual nation states who are now deciding who is going to rule. And so these turned into what we now know as unconventional warfare, asymmetrical warfare, complex humanitarian emergencies. Essentially, with slight differences, they all mean the same thing. Refugees were not common. As a matter of fact, what we began to see and are faced with even today are unprecedented numbers of internally displaced populations. So where we could tell you we had 53 million refugees, we have absolutely no idea how many internally displaced populations there are. And the interesting thing is that they may be moving regionally. There's a lot of circular kind of stuff, but they're not coming to the U.S. They're not necessarily coming to Europe. They're remaining within their own continents. But with the unconventional warfare, we soon found out that the Geneva Conventions really have very little applicability. And there was a big debate for a long time, should we have a fifth Geneva Convention, for crying out loud, okay? But we also, where these internally displaced populations were increasingly going, and as part of something that I'm going to talk about for the future, is that they were going to urban settings. And cause what we now know as rapid urbanization, which is defined as when the population exceeds the capacity of the public health infrastructure, so water, sanitation, food, health, and even the public health social protections exceeds that. So it's an unsustainable situation that actually worsens over periods of time. So the pre-Alma Ata mortality and morbidity rates that charged Alma Ata and caused that big conference to occur in Central Asia that was directed essentially by WHO, we have already exceeded those mortality and morbidity rates. And actually we are now with infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, underage 5 mortality rates, all those things that every organization judges their success on. They are the worst we've seen since the 1950s. In the urban settings, we have where rape is epidemic, and rather than the standard that we would have our hands slapped if we didn't have one pit latrine for every 20 people, they're now one for every 200 people. And women especially can't use them at night because they would end up getting raped or murdered or something in these kinds of urban environments. So we've absolutely produced a monster. And so the sphere stands, we have no real guidelines. Actually, Ranak Patel heads our working group on urbanization at Harvard. I know that Blair Rubble has, and his people here at the Woodrow Wilson Center have really, for over a decade, have written a lot about urbanization. Ranak and I were just talking about it a little while ago, but I know Blair mentioned this just during our conferences the last 2 days, the frustration that we've all felt of just getting somebody to recognize that maybe this is a problem. Nobody wants to hear about it. Now, I'm also a psychiatrist, so I could easily say, this is just denial. Matter of fact, the most common defense mechanisms that the human species has is denial. They show it in front of you, I don't see it. And that's essentially what's happening with the consequence of rapid urbanization. We have very, very little international humanitarian representation in the urban settings. We have, and we're working with some of the indigenous ones, but they're small. We're not really getting good data, but what the data we have just tells us every single time that we have something very, very serious going on. We do not know how to protect and defend the public health in an urban setting. We don't know where to dig for wells or pit latrines or anything else like that. So the problems just go on and on like that. But the important thing is that, we think of these, we had cities, mega cities, now we have meta cities where the urban and suburban sprawls are put together, which is what China has done to ensure some commonality between the urban and the suburban populations. But it has a lot more to do than populations. It's actually density of populations. So we don't even begin to keep statistics until there are about 2,000 people per square kilometer with the cities. But in Mumbai, for example, there's already, it averages 30,000 people per square kilometer, but there are major areas in Mumbai where there are 1 million people per square kilometer. So, would that violate any sphere standards? You bet your life, okay? But even in Mumbai, there are 1,600 new families entering Mumbai every single day. Now, why? Well, you have to go back actually to the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, where people in extreme poverty moved to the urban centers, and they indeed made more money, okay? We can bring that up to date now where, we call extreme poverty making less than $1.25 per day, but, people moving in extreme poverty to the urban settings are maybe going up to $2. But they still remain in extreme poverty. All right? And as a matter of fact, the curve for urban population goes up like this, and that's enough to excite you for sure and say, oh my God, but the extreme poverty rate is actually going up more vertically in these situations. All right? Now, we knew this, but you probably have read in the last couple of weeks that Paul Collier's The Bottom Billion, which he used the population data from the year 2000, is now being challenged. Population data, I think they took it from the year 2007. But where he said that 92% of the world's poor live in low-income, fragile countries. The new data now shows that 72% of the world's poor actually live in middle-income countries. Guess what they are? They're India and China, Indonesia. Matter of fact, if we just use India and China, they make up 50% of this group, all right? And so it's, I think it's just only 12% actually live in low-income, fragile states like the Congo. So it's a total reversal. So we've spent almost 20 years of crafting our foreign aid budgets or foreign aid policies around this, the MDGs, everything. Right? So this really has been a slap in the face to tell us that we have to start a new narrative about just what are we going to do. It may have been quite easy to get involved in some of the fragile states, but when we're talking about India and we're talking about China, as having larger than we ever thought populations with extreme poverty, what does, especially with sovereignty issues, what does the international community do? The other issues really focus on what we are going to be dealing with over the next decade or two. Certainly the rapid urbanization, we haven't even started, as I suggested, in even dealing with it. The other issues that I don't think this group hears about, but certainly the young people in the audience will be dealing with on a daily basis, and those are the biodiversity crises. I don't know how many of you even know what I'm talking about, but there are 34 biodiverse areas in the world. They're defined by the number of actually vascular plants and vertebrae that they have. They are the biological oxygen that feeds the rest of the world, especially in agriculture and forestry and whatever. The United States only has one biodiverse area. That's in California, starting around Sacramento and going south. But the entire country of New Zealand is a biodiverse area. Madagascar, it's all forest areas. We need to keep that. It has a lot of the world's water underneath it, and I'll talk about that. But the unfortunate thing is, with all the conflicts we've had, and remember these unconventional kind of warfare that I'm talking about, you need to know that actually more people died from these unconventional complex humanitarian emergencies in the last century than World War I, World War II, Korean War. Okay? It's hard maybe to recognize that concept, but there really have been that many casualties in that regard. But of the 34 biodiverse areas, 23 have experienced prolonged conflict. And as you can imagine, the biodiverse situations have not come back. The most recent on the list is Iraq, where I was the first Minister of Health. So that area between the Tigris and Euphrates River, when you're flying over that desert that makes up most of Iraq, all of a sudden, just a demarcation with just date trees and all the rest, and it's just packed in. Well, that, quite honestly, has been ruined, and much of it's not coming back. And in a Foreign Affairs article about 6 months ago, the Interior Minister in Iraq stated, "Thank God we have oil so we can at least buy food for the people." Okay? So that is a major problem. Along with it are emergencies of scarcity, and we're really talking about scarcity of energy, food, and water. How that's playing out is tied also to the biodiversity issue, and the fact that increasing countries that are dependent on bringing in resources like food and water for their populations, like South Korea, Japan, China, Russia, some countries in the Middle East, have been buying up a lot of the resources in different countries. I think the public commonly knows about China's requirement for getting resources for the technology in Africa, but it's much, much more than that. The amount of land in New Zealand, for example, that is owned by Japan and South Korea and others is absolutely amazing. And when you go from the airport in Auckland to Auckland itself, the taxi drivers will point out all these different places, including islands. They're as green as can be, but are owned by other countries. Thinking, I believe, at least my taxi driver thought that they were all going to be building hotels there, but no, they're actually going to be growing food for exports to their own country. Probably the most egregious act that we need to remember, did not get press. I mean, we were all very surprised, especially the journalists who covered this, and that was Madagascar. Over a 2-year period of time, South Korea negotiated with the political party in power there for a 100-year no-cost lease of half of all the arable land in Madagascar. This was all forestry land. They were planning to cut it down, employ some of the local poor, which really didn't have much of a voice, but it wasn't going to be that much in the way of employment. But cut down all the forest and to grow corn which is their staple, and also some palm oil for fuel. Finally, it began to seep in, and there was a political coup. And the first thing that was done with the new regime which has some further consequences, but at that time they were doing something that was admirable. But they canceled the contract. Now, South Korea went bonkers and said, how can you do this? Don't you realize that food is going to be the weapon of future wars and conflicts? Okay. What we found out later is that South Korea had already built ships to come, and because with the contract that they had, allowed them to use the resources below the ground. And the amount of water that was underneath that arable land actually was double the amount of water held back by the Hoover Dam. So they were going to siphon it out and bring water to South Korea. And it really, that and issues around Palestine and who owns the water there and a whole bunch of areas. Quite honestly, it's more or as much a problem with water than it is the land. But that has started what we now call distributional conflicts. Okay, and they are there, but the main issue is that they cannot be settled by nation states individually. This is obviously a global health and globalization problem, because like with food and the increasing numbers of those that now have suffer from hunger. That has increased markedly, as you know, but we still have enough food for the planet. It's obviously a distributional kind of problem. Also, the cities, the rapid urbanization is quite different in Asia than it is in Africa. Unfortunately, the people that are coming to the cities in Africa are bringing their weapons. There's a great deal of conflict, and the conflict is going to show its ugly head further. But it's pretty peaceful in most of the mega cities in Asia. But when we look at new and re-emerging diseases, so infectious diseases, they're coming from the urban centers and the dense populations in Southeast Asia. So the reason being is, again, density. We have the highest density of people living with the highest density of animal vectors. So that's where that is all coming from. But the lessons learned also from SARS, if you remember in 2003, that this started in Guangdong province in China. But there were rumors that came out. Actually, there was a Chinese military physician who came to a conference outside of China, and that's all he could talk about. So that got people buzzing, and there were emails and things like that. Everybody knew something was coming. But WHO at that time only had a passive relationship in the sense, look, we know there's a problem, we think there's a problem, can we send in a team? That was done multiple times, and China refused it every single time. All right? And finally, they acquiesced because of the pressure, and pressure from the World Health Assembly. So the WHO team came in. They landed at Beijing Airport. If you know where it is, it's quite a distance from Beijing itself. By the time they landed and then traveled to Beijing, thousands of patients were taken out of the hospitals, put in taxis, ambulances, and buses, and driven around Beijing. So the WHO team just saw an unusual disease that was troublesome, but it certainly didn't have a high number, so they walked out and said, we don't have a pandemic. Shame, shame, shame. When the truth came out, the World Health Assembly of Health Ministers overnight gave unprecedented power to WHO, so moved it from a passive organization to an active organization under international health regulation, which became a treaty then in 2007, so years afterwards. But that has changed remarkably how we work as a global community. It's provided increased capacities to countries for surveillance, increased capacity for responding to these things, and part of the treaty is that countries will help other countries. The big test was with H1N1, which thank God turned out to be something pretty mild, but in the beginning it was thought to be extremely serious because an awful lot of children were dying. All right? But the international health regulation functioned beautifully, behind the scenes, invisibly, and it was able to control it. Okay? I'm stating this because we probably need something like the international health regulations and WHO having these kind of powers for natural disasters. And so it's been written about, in part myself, but others, that OCHA, that has wonderful disaster managers but has absolutely no funding and no resources, should take on that particular role, and we would probably do better. Because as you know, the issue with Haiti was a debacle of bad coordination and other things. And so WHO and OCHA met in Cuba about 6 weeks ago, looking at the problem and stating, look, we have to change the humanitarian community. We have to have more accountability, more accreditation, and that's leading in some ways, which we have a big effort at Harvard in a blueprint for professionalizing the humanitarian community. Lastly, and I'm just going to end with this with some hope rather than gloom that I've mentioned. I'm sure you're all depressed and suicidal at this point. But, and bring it back to the climate change, because a lot of people think that, oh, climate change is in the developing world, Bangladesh and other. But if we look at the developed world that is suffering now from climate change, Australia is suffering the most. They have droughts that they never had before. They have bushfires that go 300 miles an hour. They've had the massive floods in the Northeast, unprecedented. And this is all because of climate change. But they also have a change of the vectors, because in the north they have malaria. The vectors are moving south. Melioidosis, other things are also going. But what they did in the number of, they got all the ministries together and decided that in the disaster cycle of prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery, they added 2 A's, anticipation and assessment. And so they've insisted that at every level, but right down to the local communities, they must look at all their characteristics they have, look at it in anticipation and assessment so they know what is lacking, what is needed, and then that's reported and publicly to the government so that they have a means to provide the right resources at the right time. And that was in place before the flooding. And if you remember that there was not a single fatality among that terrible flooding, so we give them some credit. It actually did work. Thank you.
Very good.
I'll speak here if that's okay. Yeah, please. Are these live? Yeah. I'm going to speak from here if that's okay, because I've got something which is called an un-PowerPoint to work with. So let's hope it works. So I think they've arranged for me to speak straight after Skip, because he's at the meta level and I'm down in the urban area of Port-au-Prince in Haiti. So it's a kind of nice follow-on. But he's absolutely right in terms of disease and density and public health, because that's what we're experiencing. And that's what the big issues that have come up, of course, with cholera. And the danger to places like City Salai, where there's such a density of population, I think about 200,000 per kilometre is what we're talking about. So a year and a bit after the earthquake, I should introduce myself. I work with the International Organization for Migration as the communications person. So a year and a bit on, where 1.5 million people were displaced. So this is the largest displacement of people, certainly in the Americas, perhaps in the Western world. So it's now down to 680,000 people. They've moved from the camps, and perhaps this camp here on the top right is the famous Petionville Golf Club, organized by Sean Penn, most famously. They've moved, so about half the population has moved out, and there's some congratulations to be given to the humanitarian community for organizing that, but really not very much, because what we find when we drill down into the statistics, and IOM has a very good registration and statistics operation, is we find that only a tiny percentage of these people have achieved what you might call durable solutions, as in sustainable housing, even transitional housing. What we're finding is that evictions are rising. Evictions are really spiking, and about 1 in 4 families in the camps, in what's left of the camps, are under current threat of eviction. So when you drill down and see where have the people gone, where have the half the population gone, you find that many of them have gone back to what they call red houses, houses that are unsafe, or they've gone back to ravines that they were voluntarily removed from this time last year because they were a danger in the rainy season, which is just upon us. So far from looking at solutions, we're now back, a year and a bit later, back into the rainy season with cholera in the system, cholera returning now with the rainy season, as the rainy season arrives upon us, and people back in a dangerous place, a more dangerous place than perhaps they've been for the last year. And of course, it's not just the rainy season, you're heading into the hurricane season on top of that. Now, at the same time, there is a good news story, which is that many, many transitional shelters are being built, so people are being taken out of plastic and put under solid roofs. But there is clearly a problem. There's a problem of perceptions. Why has more progress not taken place, given the amount of international organizations, not least my own, who've been there, given the generosity of the funding that has come through for the crisis phase? Why has more not been done? And I think most people will agree that one of the big reasons is that the reason there's a bottleneck in this crisis is that there's no access to land for ordinary people. This has a lot to do with the history of Haiti. The access to land has been, battled over for a long, long time, and there's a sense, I think, that people in the camps maybe aren't entitled to land, aren't entitled to a settlement. They're squatters, they're people who come from cities to lie, they're opportunists. Perhaps they shouldn't be part of a kind of an agreed solution. But of course, it's something for Haitians to sort out for themselves. Any questions of land, and perhaps there's a need for a national conversation, I think would be the polite way of saying it, between those who are the holders of land and the incoming government and the population and the humanitarians standing by, ready to provide the solutions, which we certainly are. So I'll just make a little diversion here to talk about the US. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from here, although I've knocked around a little bit here. One thing, as a journalist with a lot of time under my typewriter in the UK and in Ireland, one thing I've been very struck by living in the US for the last couple of years is something which you're probably not very familiar with people praising you for, which is a kind of respect within the society. I'll even say respect within the media. You think you've got a partisan media with Fox News over here and CNN over there and NPR way over there. But believe you me, when you go to other countries, what you've got here, it's the wrong analogy, but you've got a tea party going on. But just to say that, imagine you're a Fox News reporter going out on a story, being tasked by the news desk, going to cover Katrina. They're not going to demonize the individual family they're reporting on, he or she is reporting on. They're going to find the humanity in the story, because that's what makes American journalism tick. It's finding the humanity within the ordinary person. Humanizing narratives, bringing narrative to the table so that we can understand our own society, we can cope with it, we can deal with the irrational, not in a way that leads to divisions, but leads to people understanding each other and thereby helping each other. And I would suggest that that's one thing, that's a pretty nifty export, an invisible export that the US should kind of get its hand around, because a bit more respect within many of the societies we work in disasters in, I think would go a long way. And I'm not saying respect from us, because we do that, we're all very politically correct most of the time. Respect within the societies for those who are excluded from whatever it is, from power, from land, from jobs, whether by colour, whatever the background is, it doesn't really matter. So that's one thing which has been a focus of mine for a long time. What is this thing that you've got here in the US? I don't know where it comes from. Maybe it comes from the Civil Rights period, but it's certainly there. If you can just bottle that and take it elsewhere, maybe you can do some good. So that leads me on to when I arrived in Haiti last year. I was the beneficiary of a relatively small OTI grant, small by the standards of OTI grants, but big by what we were trying to do in communications. And they'd asked for engagement in two-way communications with a displaced population. And this is all very good, because they wanted the displaced population to know what the potential benefits were for them, what potential avenues they had, and to try and set up a two-way communication flow. So we did the classic thing of setting up information booths. I may even have a picture of one here in a few minutes. So these information booths, like this one here, just a classic wooden structure which ended up costing a bit of money, but the idea was that all of the humanitarian groups would put their posters up on it, and we thereby communicate with the displaced in this way. Little did I know that humanitarian groups don't really do that. You know, they put posters up on their own booths, not on somebody else's booths. So even though this was deliberately a no-logo booth that was designed so that the community would take ownership of it, and we'd have all of the stuff would be there, even the times of the tap-taps, it didn't happen that way. As an afterthought, somebody suggested putting a suggestion box on it, like we were in a Hamptons Inn or something like that. And I kind of thought about it, and being a journalist, and you get a lot of letters in newspapers, and they're usually written in different coloured inks, and we call them kind of green ink letters, and they're usually nutters who write to you. I thought, you know, this is get rid of that letterbox, it's going to be a nightmare. And went into IOM one day and said, listen, just get rid of it, forget it. A couple of days later, sort of wondered about it and thought, well, it's in the ground, we better hang on to it, and asked the engineer, has he got rid of it? He said, no. So it's still there. He ignored me, which is par for the course in Haiti, being ignored. The letterbox remained there. Long story by way of saying, 3 days after that, one of these kiosks went into Cité Soleil. One of my guys came back with a grin as wide as you can imagine, holding shopping bags of letters, 900 letters. So, I mean, you know you're onto something when you get 900 letters. Clearly there's a frustration in the population, clearly a sense that they're not being listened to by their own, I don't even want to say government because it's so weak, but by their own society, certainly by the humanitarians. So, I mean, that was kind of interesting. So we really focused from that point on the letters aspect of this thing. Part of this grant was that there would be a database. There's always got to be a database. But we hooked up with a very interesting Haitian group called NULA, or Solutions, but NULA is the name of their project, which is a crowdsourcing project whereby they have people calling in and it gets visualized on a map. So we use this for the letters. So let's get the letters onto a map. So here you have the various tools that we're using for communication. We have a radio show in the camps every day where we read out some of the letters. So one of the issues was people were saying, well, you're raising expectations off the roof, you know, you're going to cause a social explosion. People write letters and they don't get an answer. But, you know, try to come at it from a media point of view, that just because you write a letter to the New York Times bemoaning your kind of negative equity in your house doesn't mean that you're going to get a house the next day. So try to take the communications to that direction, that people have a right to communicate and that there's a benefit in communicating. And there's another benefit in that when you see, you know, voices communicating and you can tune into them, you can possibly see what the community needs, rather than what the experts or the press officers or the whatevers are telling you the community needs. Maybe you can find out what they actually need. I'll talk about this lady on the right in a few minutes here as well. But so we placed, as it says here, 140 letter boxes in camps. We got these letters, and the letters were written on scraps of paper. Some of them were, you know, pretty simple. Many of them were very elegantly written from a so-called illiterate population. Usually started off with, Dear Minister. Goodness knows where they got that idea. It gives me great pleasure to sit down and write you a note today, and what a great occasion it is to engage with you. I've got a big problem. And then they'd list their problems. Usually, I need a job, I need a house, I need some food, I'm looking after my sister's kids, my husband was killed, you name it. I mean, just pretty standard stuff. A lot of people in the humanitarian world said, well, hang on a minute, you're going to kind of, you know, this violates all the rules of protection. People are going to be writing letters about, you know, GBV and the like. But in fact, the Haitians figured it out pretty smartly. Maybe they'd been to the Hamptons. They knew this was a suggestion box, not a complaints box. They kind of got the message. So they also knew it was IOM, even though it was a no logo thing. They kind of worked it out. This is in our office, the letters being read by one of my staff, Vanessa. They then go into these envelopes, which you see in the background, and there's a stack of them, 5,000 letters, beautifully catalogued, waiting for some PhD student to do a thesis on oral history of the camps. One of the other things we do is we communicate with the population through these adventure stories, really, narratives in a comic strip form, which have proven to be very, very popular. And this particular one is about cholera. It's about to come out. So it'll be published in the next couple of weeks. It all takes place in a tap-tap. And it's about communication, because it's about people getting killed because they accuse a neighbour of spreading cholera powder. So these issues of communication are very strong in a society where there's very low literacy, very poor education, and very poor engagement between the government and the population. Rumours can create vast problems, and very quickly. So what we're attempting to do here is give people, through a storybook fashion, and it'll probably be read to people by their kids in many cases. So there's a little competition in here. There are things hidden in the middle of this cartoon. And if you answer the question at the bottom, and then you call the number, we will map you. That's our bit. We'll find out where you are. But you'll get a prize, and we'll know that you comprehended the cartoon and learned a little bit about how to prevent cholera. This page here, this person here is Sandra. You saw her picture outside putting the letter in the letterbox. She's our new mascot. But these are the letters which are synthesized by the team. And here you can find, you're managing, let's say, a camp of 50,000 people, very frustrated, very angry, very difficult to manage, because the committees change all the time, and people are, can be very hostile to the humanitarians. And by the way, a lot of the NGOs are pulling out. They've run out of money. So the pressure and the tensions are only going to rise as over the next 3 or 4 months the agencies pull out because they've run out of money. But here you can tune into a letter from somebody who's a communicator, not somebody who shouts necessarily, not the toughest person in the camp. You can even get the phone number. This is obviously not going to be public. This is for trusted users. But it gives a methodology of, using a very simple piece of technology called a letterbox, and with this silent engine in the background, a manager can now tune into an individual and get a picture of what's happening in reality in a camp. This is our mapping unit. We've worked with OpenStreetMap behind the scenes as well. And here you see the letters visualized on a map, and one of our colleagues, Gen Smork, who was an agricultural outreach worker this time last year, and is now an expert GPS leader of humanitarian OpenStreetMap. Today he's in the Dominican Republic on a training course. So the capacity to build up local capacity from the local communities is really interesting, because they're particularly interested in mapping. They're particularly interested in being able to project, being able to say, this is our reality. Don't come in here with your consultants, or don't send the government in here, or don't send MINUSTA in here. Let us map ourselves. When the cholera outbreak occurred, his team mapped 200 schools in Cité Soleil in a weekend. I mean, their capacity to work quickly, effectively, speedily, for very, very low cost, actually, is just phenomenal. These people have been really a remarkable discovery. This is what we do with the letters. They can turn them into reports. So the blue chart on the right shows that people want jobs, they want houses, and they want education. Pretty much doesn't change, but you can see trends over time as well. And here's what we call the tambour loop. The tambour is the Creole word for the drum, or the tambour, and the idea being that this is the kind of noise of the society. That's the conceit, at least. But the letters go in, we crunch them around, and the big thing is the blue thing. How do we find solutions at the end of it all? Sometimes we do. This is Karai. It's an interesting place because it's very political. It's probably how not to do it, how not to make a camp, how not to move people who are in danger into a safer place, because they were moved onto a plateau which is in danger of flooding, has no jobs, no livelihoods, a lot of people of criminal background there. So it's interesting, some of our communicators have come from there. And one of them, her name is Getty, we had her at an event for this book which we've produced of photographs of the letter writers. Here she is. And she met a senior member of a UN agency, as close as you'll get out of me. And we introduced them, and she said, "Oh, you're from Karai, that's fantastic. You've got new schools there in the camp." And our friend Getty said, "You're right, we've got new schools, it's terrific, but we've got no teachers." And you can imagine the kind of cocktail party mood was soured by this. So the head of the agency then came along and said, "Oh, well, things happen. Teachers are surely coming, I know they are." Friend Getty said, "Right, they're coming. Sure, they're coming, but not where I live in Sector 3. There we've got no schools, no teachers, no clinics, no police. We've got rape, we've got cholera, we've got problems. And by the way, can I have your coordinates, your numbers? So this was kind of interesting to me because you had somebody, from a population who's portrayed in the local media as being a hostile, angry, dangerous, you'll get kidnapped just by being there type population. Here you have somebody communicating very civilly but forcefully with the head of a UN agency. This is kind of interesting to me that this is perhaps another way of getting results. So just take it from little Getty, the community journalist as she called herself, to a more macro scale. And with this tool which we've been developing, thanks to this very generous grant, we are hoping and intending really to roll it out as a monitoring system for things like corruption, things like quality control. So we're working with the Haiti Reconstruction Fund, that's the part of the World Bank that approves the funding for many big projects. We're working with what's called the PAO, which is the accountability wing of the Interim Haiti Reconstruction Commission, to see if we can turn it into a complaints mechanism or an anti-corruption mechanism. So the plan is to put about 200 letterboxes again in little community radio stations around the country, have people pick up the letters, use the radio stations to communicate that people have the right to talk about the projects they've been given, so that the mother standing in front of the school, which was built with the generosity of the taxpayers of the US or Canada or Japan, and that school, which we all know in so many countries, you build a beautiful school or the hospital and you come back 6 months later, there's no teachers, there's no nurses, there's nothing. It's a shell, it's a joke, because the resources have been creamed off or pushed away by forces, let's call them that. So let's engage with that individual, the Getty, who confronted the UN agency chief. Let's find lots of those mothers whose only interest is in their children. People who have no interest in personal enrichment, no interest in diverting funds, no interest in anything but a perfect project, just as you wanted it when you funded it. And let's cut out the middlemen and the middlewomen and the people who tend to block and change and challenge and stop the many, many projects over many, many years in many, many countries from becoming the things they were meant to be and they were funded to be. So the system just also has the capacity to deliver email alerts, and it's a simple tool, it's not a complicated thing, but you could, if you were that interested, be sitting here and finding out what is the rate of evictions by the emails coming through and the messages and the phone calls. So the idea is to keep it as open as possible so that people can see it. This guy with his head cut off on the bottom, advisedly, is the coroner of Port-au-Prince. A member of staff of a well-known international organization was murdered in September while getting his first paycheck. On his way back, he was pulled off the tap and murdered. They then brought the family down to the morgue to take his body out, and of course there had to be an autopsy, and to get the coroner from Delma, not too far away, down to the morgue, cost $950. That was his bill. There was an urgency to get the family the body back. The guy knew that there was a big organization involved, so he exacted his price. Call it what you will, but he exacted his price. A bit of civic engagement, a bit of a conversation about these things might make it more difficult for him to do that. He certainly does it to local Haitians because the family were then billed $50 just for the clothes of the dead man. It's not unfamiliar, it happens everywhere. But it needs to be part of the conversation so that his life isn't so comfortable. Something similar has happened at the airport where somebody chucked a bucket of water into the border management system because they were paid to. But because it's not part of a conversation, it never becomes part of a solution. And my suggestion is that we need to help create these respectful conversations in these countries where we do so much hard work and we see so much of it go nowhere. These two maps show, the one on your left shows World Bank projects, and the world on the right shows interaction projects, 400 or so. So what we'd like to do is take these projects, both of them, plus IOM projects and others, and allow the population to speak about them. So that where there's a problem, it's so hard to find out where there's a problem. There's so many of them. And monitoring and evaluation remains filed away in the bottom of a filing cabinet. Let it be visible, and let us see where mothers are protesting because the hospital isn't working. It's a simple concept, and the technology is really dead simple. Here's our friend Sandra again, and we think the more voices you have in the system, the better. The more you can tune out noise from signal, the better, obviously. We think it should be an open system, designed openly, so you get collaboration and you can take it to other countries. And we think, above all, that Haitians need not only to have a role in reconstruction, because nobody's stopping them, but to know that they have a role and know how to have a role. It's part of the problem. We have a little website, which is a kind of a baby Huffington Post for them, called Citizen Haiti. I encourage you to look at it. And using tools like this, the website is used really for the radio stations to podcast programs and to play them. And we work with theatre groups, including this one, and you'll see it on the website. I won't play it for you now. There's other people waiting to hear. Okay.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for having invited me. And these 2 days that I have spent here, learnt a lot and discussed a lot. What I'm going to do, basically, is to raise 6 points and try and illustrate them. But before I do that, I'd just like to say that my work has consisted in advising and in planning projects around disaster for governments, for NGOs, for international agencies, but mainly for the government. And the pilot projects that I initiated were for organizations that I chair today. Now, this whole experience has more recently been around the floods in Pakistan, where 20 million people have been affected, and over 3,000 villages have been wiped out, including a very large number of towns that have been submerged. This was to 2010, and 2005 was the big earthquake in Kashmir and in the northwest of Pakistan that killed 120,000 people and displaced another and made another 1.5 million homeless. So these were very large disasters. And so the manner in which you deal with these large disasters is very different from the manner in which you deal with small disasters. First thing that I would like to point out, first point I would like to raise is the tyranny of technology. 3 days after the Kashmir earthquake in 2005, the minister in charge of rehabilitation asked me to come to Islamabad from Karachi. So I went to see him. At that time, he had with him, and it was only 3 days after the earthquake, he had with him 6 international companies who had flown in with plans for providing housing, prefab housing, of bringing it in from abroad, prefab schools. And I said to the minister, I said, how many are you going to build at this cost? And he said, but these are ideal, they are so lovely, they are so beautiful. I said, but the building materials for reconstruction are lying in the rubble of the houses. There are stones, there are timber, there are doors, there are windows. All this is over there. And they just need to be reused in a manner that that they are earthquake resistant in the future. So that set off a dialogue, and I wrote in the press about it. My colleagues took it up, and the press made it into a very big issue in support of local materials and local technologies. The media played a very important role in this. And then those NGOs and those government agencies that started using these materials, it was interesting. They provided tools to people so that they could pick up their rubble, sort it out. And this was a very important healing process. The communities just did not wait there for help and aid. the tools were provided to them, they started collecting the material, sorting it out. Then we provided tools whereby they could cut the larger timber sections into smaller sections. And so this became a very big program over time. Now this is one. This technology issue is a very important issue. And the speed with which you are able to react is a very important issue. The second thing is the importance of a governance system. This is very important because without an effective governance system, you cannot provide rehabilitation or relief, neither of the two things. Again, as there's a discussion with the minister, I and my colleague proposed a governance system. We said that you have 212 union councils. The union council is the smallest rung of local government, where you have a population of anything between 10,000 to 50,000. And we said we have 212 union councils. Let us get 212 good revenue officers, give each one of them a winterized tent. It was quite cold then. A cook, a secretary, a computer, and ask all government officials in that union council to report to them. This would be the focal point for all aid and finances for this area. And the planning would be done at this level through mobile teams of planners. Now, this was also agreed upon. But then, 3 days later, there was a big meeting in which international agencies, the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, etc., participated, and they opted to have a highly centralized system in Islamabad, far away from where the earthquake took place. You established a organization that was going to manage earthquake reconstruction organization. And that set down rules and regulations of how the finances that were available were going to be spent. And one of the biggest sum of money was for compensating the victims so that they could begin a life first and then subsequently more money for building their homes. Now this was, in my opinion, a disaster because for getting yourself registered, you had to have an identity card. The vast majority of women in that region had no identity cards. Most of the men had no identity cards. So there were long queues at government offices, that those that survived, people struggling to get identity cards and not getting them while they were freezing in winter without any money. The other issue was that once you had an identity card, you had to go and open a bank account because you were given a check. There were no banks in most of the villages, so people had to travel to banks. If the decentralized system had been accepted, we would have no need for banks or for identity cards. The communities were small enough. The Union Council knew exactly how many people there were there. They knew exactly how many houses there were because of the census reports. And I feel that this system was responsible for an enormous amount of suffering. But more than suffering, it created a big division, a big gap between government agencies, international financial institutions, NGOs, and the people. Because here you had very serious trust problems emerging. And it forced the agencies who were managing this money to view local populations with hostility and with suspicion. So it became a policing thing rather than anything else. I think it was a very serious matter, and we did a similar thing again now with the floods in 2010. And there are very sad stories associated with this whole thing. There are many people who still haven't got their money. The third thing that I would like to raise is that pre-disaster situations determine the effectiveness of relief and rehabilitation. What existed before the disaster situation. And here I'd like to give two examples. There is something known as the Pakistan Poverty Alleviation Fund, and that funds all over the country. It gives small grants to CBOs and to small NGOs for development work. And the condition is that that development work is tied in with communities. Rather amorphous thing, a community, but that is how it is defined. Now, the Poverty Alleviation Fund was very quick in arranging disaster mitigation, simply because it had links with all these organizations that were all over the country. Its partner organizations, it could fund them immediately, and those organizations had received training. So in their areas where they were operative, conditions improved more quickly than in other areas. My own organizations, which I chair, they have also a network all over Pakistan of small CBOs whom they finance and they aid, give technical support to. And so from these CBOs we got messages, send us money quickly, we have to give food to the people. Our director said that we are not going to give you any money at all. You should feel ashamed of yourself asking for money. You've been giving microcredit to these entrepreneurs in your areas. You have peasant committees. They can't fund feeding their own people. And we refused to give any money. 2 or 3 days later, they started feeding the populations. And then we put another condition. We said, no, after 2 weeks, no cooked food. You have to give them fuel and they have to cook themselves. This whole attitude of begging and waiting for food in queues has to come to an end. They cook. And that again worked. But what I would like to say here that these were small projects. They did not reach out to even 10% of the population that was affected. Because the scaling up process of such thinking, of such projects, the mindset was not there for it in government, NGO, and international funding agencies. But hopefully it will be in the future. Then, this was the third point. The fourth point, yes, in this instance it is also important that there are organizations around animals, animal protection, etc. They were contacted for livestock because villages without livestock, human beings living in villages without livestock, they are really completely broke. They cannot function. They cannot do agriculture. And these organizations supported the animal population with fodder. So there are these linkages that one has to be aware of, I think. Then there is a big difference between what people want and what politicians want. I give an example of a town that was submerged underwater. I was asked to come and give a plan of how it could be rehabilitated. We spoke to the people, and the people said, we don't want the government to build our houses because half the money will go to the contractors. There will be commissions in this. Please give us the money, we will build our own houses if you can provide technical assistance and guidance. So the plan was worked out. However, it was not followed because the politicians wanted a beautiful model town. They were very clear about it. And that model town is now being financed by USAID about 8 months after the flood and about 3 months after the water was sort of drained out of that place. So there is this gap, and this is because of an absence of communication and also because of the megalomania of politicians. The fifth point that I would like to raise is the problems with NGO culture. It alienates. It prevents true partnerships. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is its affluence, which is visible. The other is the language gap. The third is that they do not eat and drink together with local populations. And here we have a very successful case of Cuban doctors who came to after the Kashmir earthquake, a very large team. They were absolutely loved by the people simply because they came and lived with them in their own houses. They ate their food, they drank their water, they didn't carry loads of mineral water bottles with them, and there was much weeping from the local population when the doctors went back, although they could not speak the language. And they left behind a large number of trained people simply because they stayed there in a large numbers, which cannot be done just by visiting through. So there are these problems. And there are a number of very successful cases of people and groups who stayed with people, helped them through. I think that made all the difference. The sixth thing is what happens afterwards. These regions are so badly devastated that to rehabilitate their agriculture, to rehabilitate their transport, their water supply systems, is a very, very daunting task because of the scale of the tragedy. And this rehabilitation cannot be done without effective local government organizations. This we have seen, that where the local government organizations were strong and effective, it was done much faster. Where they did not exist, it was not done. Where they were comparatively weaker, it was slower. So this is something that we have learned, and here I would like to point out something also. In 1987, there was a very big drought for a long period of time in the south of Pakistan, and I was asked to manage relief and subsequent development. It became clear to us that the drought was not because of lack of rainfall. The famine was not because of the drought, but it was because of social changes that had taken place in the desert. And we decided to set up a research and extension agency organization in the desert with local people, so that the future development that was required and necessary to overcome the problems that the desert would face again could be taken care of. And here I would like to say that in 87, you didn't have terms like social capital, sustainability, public-private partnership, business of the state not to do business, facilitation. These terms did not exist. It was a simple, straightforward local government affair with the communities, and it worked. And that Research and Training Institute today has completely changed the face of that desert. The reason was that there was a docile population. You don't have docile populations anymore. You have very violent ones, very demanding ones. You have strong government agencies, which you don't have anymore. It's a receding state, receding involvement in these things. And so we have suggested, both for the flood areas, we have suggested 3 research and training institutions. We suggested 2 for the earthquake areas, but they did not happen. This was considered by the state to be an NGO venture, that the NGO should do. Well, the NGOs didn't do it. But in 1987, a strong state did do it. And it made all the difference. What I'm trying to say over here is, when the scale of disaster is so large, conventional projects, the type of which I have, conventional in the sense that they are community-managed, community-run projects with which I have worked for the last 35 years of my life, cannot deliver alone. They have to be supported through a decentralized system. And the planning of that decentralized system should be small parts of a larger whole, which has the possibility to let go. The problem is that you can't let go. The federal government, the international agencies that cooperate and work with it cannot let go. They have to police this development. And it is the policing of this development that makes it very, very difficult for trust to be established. And without that trust, it is difficult to rehabilitate and to provide relief. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to try from here. Leonard says this should work, so let's see if it works. It's magic or not. So I wanted to conclude as the last speaker talking about the lessons I've learned about retrieving wisdom from those in need. I'm from Rwanda, and I wasn't in Rwanda during the genocide, but I had family in Rwanda. And as a Rwandan, the genocide the 1994 is a place in my life that will always be central. It defines who I am and who I'll always be. And tomorrow, every year, on April 7th, in Rwanda, we commemorate the genocide. And usually I'm in Rwanda at this time of year. And when I was invited to take part in this retreat, talking about retrieving the wisdom of those in need, I thought, what an opportunity for me to meet people from all over the world to as I've told, Philip calls me the sponge. I wanted to learn from people who came from Thailand, who had experience in Vietnam, who'd worked in very different settings in Haiti, in Congo, in Burundi, in Bosnia, and say, what are the lessons you've learned, and how can I take them back when I go back to Rwanda? So what I'd like to share with you are some of the lessons I learned prior to coming here. And the title of this talk is called Retrieving a Fabric of Resilience. And so this first picture shows a master weaver in Rwanda who works for a program called Baskets of Hope. And you may have seen their products at Macy's. And so what Baskets of Hope does is allow women to earn up to $10 a day weaving baskets and all sorts of other art products that are sold on international and local markets. And this master weaver, what she does is she trains other women. And some of the women who are trained in the Baskets of Hope program are women with HIV, some who contracted it during the genocide. And when the women come for the training, they spend 2 weeks in a training center where not only they learn the weaving techniques, but they also learn about nutrition, about health, about taking care of their children, about how to rebuild the fabric of their communities. And so for me, there's an interesting relationship between weaving these baskets that are allowing these women to have economic empowerment and what it requires after time of trauma to reweave the fabric of society. So what I'd like to share with you is something I read at my mother's funeral. My mother didn't die during the genocide, but we were very lucky to have her for a number of years after. And I learned a lot through her life and through her death. So this is what I read. My mother didn't cook. She served you love on a platter. Her love was infectious. Her laugh was infectious. Her smile all-encompassing. From the moment I was born, I knew I was special. I was the only girl. The one she always said she would leave everything. From the time I was small, she would show me all her jewels and tell me one day they would all be mine. That was a long time ago, before the war, before the terror, before the genocide. In the span of a few months, starting April 1994, all our dreams died. Jewels were stolen, dear friends died cruel deaths, and all that was left was a few precious photographs that were left behind in the banana grooves. When everything else was taken or purposefully destroyed, that was all we had. You see, my mom was scheduled to be killed then, but fate decided otherwise. We were blessed with 11 more years of her presence on this earth. During these 11 years, she created opportunities for hundreds in the form of a good word leading to a job, employment on our home farm in Rutongo, favors here and there based on trust. She used her business acumen not only to create jobs, but to strengthen a community that did not dare believe in hope. During those 11 years, she was a witness to 2 of her sons' weddings, 3 baptisms of her grandchildren, as well as from a distance, be part of 2 of her other children's weddings, including mine. God gave us 11 extra years of her earthly presence when she took her last breath. My daughter was 9 months, and sadly she never got to meet my mother. I still hear my mother whispering to me into the night, "Be happy, child of mine. Strive for the best. Persevere, and when all hope is gone, persevere some more, because I will always be a bright light in any darkness that life will bring onto you." So one of the things we've been talking about in the last few days are disasters. But also, I think what's important to remember is how do we reweave, how do we dream again together? Skip was talking about the crisis, the biodiversity crisis in the world. And so one of the projects I've been involved in is looking at African biodiversity that's present at least 26% of the biodiversity across the world. And looking at how traditional knowledge can be used to access African biodiversity to treat tropical neglected diseases that are being amplified by the effects of climate change. And so this is a group of us from different countries in Africa and US and Germany. And we have been dreaming collectively for a number of years, and we've now gotten our second round of Bill and Melinda Gates Grand Challenge funding to look at drug discovery from African biodiversity. And the idea for me behind it is not only about innovation, but it's also about finding a way to say, here is African wisdom, and how can we bring it into modern times to help solve issues that happen, that come up when disasters happen. Because one of the issues is often medicine comes from elsewhere. And when medicine comes from elsewhere, in times of crisis, you don't have access to it. But if we're able to produce medicines locally, then there's a lot easier access. So one of the important things after trauma is favoring conditions that allow people to dream collectively. And what we did was we started dreaming before any funding was even available, but just because we believed in the idea. And so it's not about waiting for the funding opportunity, but it's saying, if I could dream any dream, what would it be? And so one of the things that inspires me is, how can this help young Rwandans dream and access whatever talents they have so they can contribute to healing and the reweaving of community? And one of the things that's really important to know about Rwanda is the population structure. There are very few elders left in the society. And if we compare Rwanda to Canada, if you look at the pyramids, they're very different. For example, in my own family, there's nobody left really above 50 years old. So the wisdom of the elders is something that has disappeared in some ways. We can still access it. I mean, there are archives, there are stories, there's music, there's art. But the reality is for the youth who are here today, and youth in Africa represents 450 million people under 15. So that's more than the whole population of the United States. And what's important is that in societies where youth have gone through man-made or naturally based disasters, is how do you allow them to dream, and how do you allow them to access wisdom? So one of the projects I initiated, working with Rwandan youth and a Rwandan photographer and a Canadian filmmaker, is looking at, it's a project that we call Ashes to Light. And the metaphor is that this is based on a native Indian metaphor, that when a tree grows, the rings of the tree represent the absorption of light into matter. And when this tree is cut down and burnt, the ashes that are left over will produce light again through the fire. And so my idea is when you have a community that has been reduced to ashes, how can you retrieve that light, that hope, so that transformation can happen? And the hard thing is how do you bring that back to the youth? So one of the things I've been doing is linking Rwandan youth to Holocaust survivor elders. And in this case, Ted had survived Auschwitz. And so we linked him with Eliane, who during the 100 days of the genocide had his whole family separated, and he walked with his father, who was a medical doctor, and who a number of times was saved because the person who was going to kill his father said, "You know, I remember you, you saved my leg." And they said, "I'll let you go." But sadly, before the end of the 100 days, Eliane's father was killed. But Eliane persevered, moved forward, came to Canada, and is now finishing a law degree at McGill, which is a really good faculty in Canada in terms of law. And so what we did is we brought Eliane in discussion with Ted, because Ted at 17, 18 came to Canada with about $1 in his pocket and had to recreate his whole life and had lost all of his family. And the idea is retrieving the wisdom from those who've gone through the unimaginable and having them share their experiences so that youth know that even though they've lost everything, there is ways to move forward. And so what this 3-hour dialogue between Eliane and Ted was a sharing of memories, a sharing of pictures, of experiences. And the idea is how can we create these spaces to allow youth to be inspired and access global wisdom from elders from other continents so that they can move forward and transform their lives and the lives of their communities. And the initial picture I showed was a picture of my mother actually standing next to Coretta Scott King. And what was amazing for me when I was working on this presentation was I realized how hard Coretta Scott King had worked to get her husband's birthday recognized, and has become a holiday. And to think of the loss she went through and all the people who were involved in making Martin Luther King Day happen. And to say, instead of being in a position of despair, and saying, how can we come to celebrate the life, the legacy? And it's really about reimaging hope for me. And how do we recreate that in other spaces where disaster, great loss has happened? And sadly, we can't really see it, but at the bottom is a picture of me with 2 colleagues from Congo. One of my interests as being Rwandan is to work with colleagues from neighboring countries to say, how can we build peace locally? And what was interesting for me is one of my 2 Congolese colleagues was a nurse who had worked in the refugee camps in Goma taking care of Rwandans. And so this is another narrative that I'd never heard about. I'd heard about how Rwandans had gone into Congo to take it over. I heard about how the Interahamwe were controlling the camps, how the international humanitarian organizations couldn't stop that process from happening. But I had not heard the positive stories of Rwandans and Congolese reaching out and being there for each other. And what was interesting to me is after the camps were stopped, this woman who was a nurse, well, there was no job for her anymore. But then Congo went through a process of preparing for the first elections in over 40 years. And she was asked to become one of the women involved in going out in the community and getting more women involved in the election commission. And so this was something she'd never done. But she got into it, and what was interesting is women in Congo met with women in Rwanda and Burundi, and so what we call the CPGL, and were able to share with women in Rwanda and Burundi who had already gone through elections and learn from their experiences and take that back so that in the first election that was happening in over 40 years in Congo, the women in Congo were empowered. And so what's important to me is that these other narratives of cooperation come out so that they give hope to women, to children, to communities, of the other ways, other things that are happening that may not be under our radar. And how can we, in our different roles, promote any of these initiatives? And as I said earlier, youth in Africa under 15 are 450 million. And whatever work we do, whether we're in global health, whether we're in community development, whether we're in innovation, whether we're grant policy making, advocacy group, what are the different ways we can tap into our own knowledge to help the youth in Africa or elsewhere achieve their dreams, so that what we have not been able to achieve in terms of peace building, in terms of sustainability, in terms of preserving ecosystems can happen. And it's about how do we prepare for that change to happen. So I'd like to leave you on this message. Thank you.
Thank you all for very rich and different presentations. We have just a little bit of time for some questions. I think maybe what we can do is collect them and then give our panelists an opportunity to respond as a collective. My colleague Lauren and Hannah have microphones so that you might be able to amplify, but also so we can record for those watching online your questions. Who would like to jump in and pose a question to any of our panelists? A gentleman here.
My name is Frank Dahl. I'm a professional that works with disasters and emergencies around the world, recently Iraq and Afghanistan. In fact, I was responsible for reconstructing the educational system that didn't really work out because there were a number of problems, and you've raised many of the issues. One of them was that we didn't, of course, work closely enough with our national counterparts. We scared them away. The question, there were a number of questions and comments. I thought all the presentations were excellent and very enriching and certainly complementary to my own experience. But one to Frederick, I don't mind. I hope you don't mind my calling everybody by their first names. You talked extremely well about biodiversity and the impact that has, or the impact that we're having on that has then on development, especially in disaster situations. What about the whole notion of climate? That was raised indirectly by a number of people, but my feeling is that climate could be quite crucial to all aspects, including poorer societies and richer societies, because we're all going to be affected equally, so to speak. And climate in the sense of flooding, and flooding of low-lying areas, producing crisis and disaster that maybe we're not ready for, and we need to talk more about. I'm wondering whether you could comment on that. That was one issue. The other issue was Arif's whole issue of bringing communities in and making the response local. I couldn't agree with you more. I think where we failed is that we haven't made it local. But a little more about the housing solution. It's interesting that you suggest we ought to go back to what is there already, and that makes a great deal of sense in terms of rescuing materials, pulling out what is available, and reconstructing. But very often, very little is available after certain sorts of disasters for you to be able to do that. Isn't there a mixed response that is required here in terms of things like shelter? Because shelter, of course, is one of the most important responses initially. The other issue I think that was raised, but only indirectly, is that I think probably the most crucial issue for me in my wanderings around with UNICEF, I'm an ex-UNICEF person, particularly in arid situations and semi-arid situations, is the whole notion that water is probably one of the most important commodities, and that the joke we had in the Middle East, and I spent 9 years in the regional office in the Middle East looking after the 22 or so Arab and non-Arab countries, the joke there was that the next major war was going to be not about oil, but about water, because water was actually more expensive than oil. We're not quite there yet, but I think we're going to get there at some point. So I'm wondering whether we couldn't comment on that. It's linked, to, of course, to the whole climatic and weather issue that I raised as well. Just a few comments, I think.
Okay. We want to give folks another chance, because I'm afraid because we've gone long, we have to collect them all at once. So are there other questions, sir?
My name's Jim Byrne. I'm a journalist here in town who wallows in policy stuff. I'd like to ask Mr. Doyle, does the election yesterday, if indeed it holds up, are people hopeful it'll make a difference? I mean, Haiti's the most poorly governed country I know of, and is there any hope this will be different? I know a lot of Haitians, and one of my dearest friends says, who's from there, he says, we Haitians have never learned to forgive each other.
Okay. Any other opportunities? I think I'll throw a final one in there then, which is across this panel and certainly across the discussions of the last couple of days, we've had contrasts in terms of experience and lessons from post-disaster and post-conflict, and sometimes those going together. But are there reflections that you have from those conversations about what those communities might learn from one another, given that there's often perhaps less dialogue among them or between them than we might imagine? So panelists have an opportunity to make kind of closing reflections. Skip, would you like to start?
So quickly on the climate change, I think a couple of things. First off, part of what we are calling climate change has obviously been occurring for 300 years. Okay, and probably more. I should have. I don't know why. I've only lived for 300 years, so I thought I'd just keep going. But you know, that part, society alone, human society could live with, you know, buying summer homes in Canada. But it's the other issues of the carbon emissions, acidification of the oceans and whatever, that are certainly human-made. So the combination of the two is what we see. It depends on how we define it, okay? So I think that is part of my answer to you. It's the teasing out that becomes extremely political. And, you know, that's difficult. I'm a physician, but I must say that I read Nature, and now there's a Nature climate change. A lot of new nature journals have emerged since the end of the last administration. A lot of data came out the day after the administration. So there's, you know, the political issues, and we're still getting it. There is much more being done outside of the United States on climate change, and much more interest than it is here. We remain terribly ignorant to it. And so I guess that, because we have to have other people speak, but I hope that helps in your decision. Defining it and defining the extent of it, there are some things like acidification and that have gone over the tipping point, okay? We don't know whether that's recoverable. There are other issues that, if you affect one, they all get affected. So there are nuances like that in climate change, which I'd be glad to send you or talk to you about it.
Arif?
Yeah. Actually, you can't really go back, but you can use the same materials. Going back is difficult. Because if you take a look at the Kashmir situation, those were roofs that were mud roofs, thick layers of mud for insulation that were laid on the timber rafters. That was how people died, really. So what we did do was we kept the same walls, reinforced them with timber, and the roofs were GI sheet roofs with insulation under that. But the timber trusses were huge trusses, so we were able to cut them by providing each village with a electric oar. So with much smaller sized timber, you could have the trusses made, and you could reinforce the mud walls with those to make them earthquake resistant. But here I would like to point out one thing that is important. That is, whenever a disaster of this nature takes place, the prices of building materials shoot up. The prices of labor shoot up. There is large-scale black marketing. And the same thing happened in the drought in 1987. But at that time, the government, it happened with fodder at that time. And so the government was imposed, it had something known as Section 144 we have in Pakistan, where you can, it's a sort of local level emergency. And they decided that this fodder, no fodder could be sold or purchased except through the government agencies. There may have been a small amount of corruption, but that made fodder available at much cheaper prices. We tried to get the same thing done for the materials in the Kashmir earthquake, but we did not succeed. It didn't happen. But this is a very important factor because prices went up by 30 to 40% within a month and a half.
And just to answer your other question on the water, you're absolutely right. And so we are, people are coming out and saying it's more about the water than it is the land. But it is certainly, Lake Victoria has dropped 10 feet. You go to Africa, and what were raging rivers are trickles. The real issue is going down deeper with the aquifers. Are they not viable, and they are disappearing? So that is a real problem. China, where 2/3 of their 600 cities do not have drinkable water. But that's a population that is 20% of the world's population, but they only have 2 to 5% of the water resources. So there is going to be this, what I hinted at with the land grabbing, it's going to start getting much more active, and it'll start off as some part of distributional conflict, but then I'm sure get worse. And it's always been an issue in Palestine because the Israelis own the water, okay? So, it is already an issue, but it's like urbanization. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to admit to it, and it's just too complex to bring up. But you're
recent trend is the Saudis and Emirates going out to buy chunks of Africa. And they just bought whole chunks of the Blue and White Nile land area because they needed the water and the land, of course, to grow whatever it is that they need.
Right.
Food, of course, in the future. They bought that up. Madagascar, of course, was very well. With the Koreans, was a good example.
I'd like to comment on the climate change. One of my interests as a Rwandan woman, as an African woman, is how to promote engagement of policymakers locally in terms of biodiversity preservation so that we can preserve the water tables. And so I'm working on different strategies. One is the drug discovery from local biodiversity so that there's a correlation between local pharmaceutical industries and BNP. So it's how do you talk to a minister of finance to get it? And so if we're able to produce our medicines locally, well, then we grow our economies. And if that depends on us preserving our biodiversity for you to have your coffers full, well, then there's engagement from the Minister of Finance. And if you get an engagement from Minister of Finance, everybody will align. So that's one of the strategies. The other area that I think needs to be tapped into more are the mitigation and adaptation strategies and the billions of dollars that are on the table, but that require capacity building in terms of African policy institutions to be able to tap into these funds for avoided deforestation, for agriculture-based practices that will preserve aquifers. And so there's a lot of mechanisms and money out there, but capacity building is needed so that local institutions can tap into them and communities can benefit and become the stewards of preserving the water tables as well as the biodiversity. So I think there's a lot of, as much as there's a lot of gloom, there's a lot of hope because there's a lot of tools that are now available. And if we're able to have a transfer to technology of capacity and so that the populations can tap into these mechanisms, we can start to move out of it.
Yeah, just on the question of Haiti, well, it's like many troubled small countries, including my own, it's had maybe too much politics for the last while, and difficult leadership, poor leadership, and poor circumstances. But one thing I think is true now is that, just judging by looking at Twitter here, the population in Haiti is pretty relaxed about it. They were not relaxed when there was an attempt to steal the election before Christmas, and you saw people out in the streets burning tires and the rest. So at least there seems to be a sense that they've got the person they wanted to elect. Now, what happens next is another question. The feedback I can give you is just from, anecdotally, but people I know who have worked closely with incoming President Martelly say that, he admits he's not a political expert. That's not his background at all. But they say that he listens. And, that's kind of something interesting in a politician or a leader, that they listen. So I'm afraid I can't give you more than that, but at least it's a complete new broom.
Well, thank you to the five of you. Thank you to our audience. Obviously, a wide-ranging and vexing set of challenges, but I think we've had some very specific cases where we see insights that are lessons that if we do step back and listen, and at the same time take seriously some of these challenges that look insurmountable but can be broken apart and finding some very practical solutions, and there is real prospects for making progress. So I want to thank the five of you for the past days and for this afternoon, and please join me in thanking our